Good afternoon, everyone, or good afternoon on the East Coast. Good morning if you're talking to us from west of here. My name is Ken Wissoker. I'm Senior Executive Editor at Duke University Press, and very honored and excited to be hosting this webinar today with two really fantastic authors and then a hero of us all. And I think we're going to have a really wonderful discussion. This is on the occasion of the publication of Universal Tonality, the life and music of William Parker. Very honored to have him join us, and as well as the publication of Soundworks by Anthony Reid, who is here. And so let me introduce everybody. And then Cisco Bradley, who's the author of this Universal Tonality book, will talk a little, and then we'll open it into discussion. William Parker was born in the Bronx in 1952. He's a musician, composer, writer, educator, has really been central to what avant-garde jazz music, but also more wider through Vision Fest, what the New York free scene has been for decades. He's recorded way over 40 albums. If you get Cisco Bradley's book, you will see in the back in the discography, in very small print, it goes on for pages, every album that William Parker was on and participated in. And just coming out now is a new 10 CD set, all new work, not a collection, all new work, Migration of Silence into and Out of the Tone World, published by Centering Music. And Universal Tonality is like a kind of key concept of Mr. Parker's that suffuses this work. Cisco Bradley is Associate Professor of History at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, where he's taught since 2011, scholar of experimental music and sound, employing historical and ethnographic methods. He founded jazzrightnow.com in 2013 and tweets from the same, and also the Free Jazz Oral History Project in 2016, which is collected over 220 interviews with artists from New York and around the globe. Universal Tonality, The Life and Music of William Parker is his second book. And he's working on a greater, larger history of the experimental music scene in Brooklyn as we speak. And finally, Anthony Reid is Associate Professor of English at Vanderbilt University, author of two books, the award-winning Freedom Time, The Poetics and Politics of Black Experimental Writing, and Soundworks, Raised Sound and Poetry in Production, which is out from Duke University Press. And in that book, he talks about Langston Hughes's collaboration with Charles Mingus, Amira Baraka's work with the New York Art Quartet, Jane Cortez's album with the Fire Spitters, as well as multimedia projects of Archie Shepp, Matana Roberts, Cecil Taylor, and Jeannie Lee. So you can see what kind of discussion we're going to have about cross-mediated Black genius and Black creativity across music and other arts. And I think we have a real treat in store. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cisco, who can talk a little about the process and the book itself.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. I wanted to start by thanking a few people. First, and of course, to thank Duke University Press and Ken Wissoker for believing in this project and helping make this book a reality. It's been a long, really exciting process of writing this book and working on it. And it's been great to work with the press that I feel like has really tried to facilitate all of this and make it as good of a book as it can be. So I can't say enough good things about how I've found working with the press. I'd also like to thank Professor Anthony Reid for joining us today. His recent book, also on Duke University Press, as Ken mentioned, Soundworks, Race, Sound, and Poetry in Production, looks phenomenal. I'm very much looking forward to reading it. So I'll be doing that as soon as I can. I'm really looking forward to engaging with that work. And I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies at the Pratt Institute, many of whom are in attendance today, and also for Pratt's support of my research. I would also like to thank all of the people who agreed to do interviews for this book. And there's quite a few, but I do want to mention them all. First, of course, Patricia Nicholson Parker, Miriam Parker, Matthew Shipp, Cooper Moore, Steve Swell, Lena Conquest, Andrew Cyril, Milford Graves, Hamid Drake, Andrew Barker, Dave Sewellson, Dave Burrell, Jackson Kroll, Jason Kao Huang, Rob Brown, Joshua Abrams, William Hooker, James Brandon Lewis, Luke Stewart, Matt Lavelle, and Stephen Joerg. Really appreciate everybody who took time to talk about William's work. And I felt like I got just invaluable perspectives, especially from people who, of course, have known William Parker much longer than I have. So that was all such an incredible, I think, kind of show from the community about kind of the respect that people have for Mr. Parker. I also want to mention two writers I've worked with closely over the years at Jazz Right Now who have been amazing touchstones in all kinds of music-related concepts and ideas and things. Just feel great people to bounce ideas off of, and that is Gabriel Van Landingham Dunn and John Morrison. Finally, I would, of course, like to thank William Parker himself. Writing this book really has been the greatest honor of my professional life. So, we're here today to launch Universal Tonality, the first book about bassist, composer, multi-instrumentalist, and poet William Parker. The goal that I set at the outset of working on this book was to explore Mr. Parker's singular artistic vision. As one of the foremost American musical visionaries of his generation, he has had a profound impact on jazz. He is a major contemporary composer and is one of the principal leaders of the artist community in New York. Rising from the 1970s lofts and from more than a decade of working with pianist Cecil Taylor, William Parker has been continuously touring domestically and internationally in leading his bands for 5 decades. Today, I would like to begin by talking about what process we pursued to bring this book into being. From the very beginning, I wanted to make sure that William Parker's personal experience and perspective was the central narrative that pushed the book along. So we conducted 21 interviews over the span of 3 years, during which we discussed each aspect of his life and music in turn. The first quarter of the book examines his origins. William Parker's music is of historical importance, but is also deeply rooted in a history. So I felt that from the beginning that it would be important to build a historical context befitting his work. But what would that context be? The first step was to document his life growing up in the South Bronx in the 1950s and 1960s. That soon led to a deeper delve back through the generations of his family. Because Parker and his ancestors collectively survived the Middle Passage, slavery in the American South, the false promises of Reconstruction, and life in a northern ghetto, this book has as its starting point contemporary debates on what has been termed the afterlives of slavery. Threads of resistance passed down to him form a backdrop to his work as an artist. Everyone who knows William Parker is aware that he has an impeccable memory. Not only does he remember the details of events that occurred early in his life, he could tell me with inscrutable detail how hearing a particular record affected him as a kid, how reading various books changed his perspective on life, or how seeing films or natural phenomena in the Bronx profoundly opened sensory worlds to him. From very early in the process, it was clear that Parker's narrative voice was to be the driving force in the book, around which everything else was to be built. As his own father was deeply affected by the Harlem Renaissance and bestowed that to his son, Parker came of age during the Black Arts movement and Black Power eras, and his coming of age in the 1960s had an indelible effect upon him that has guided him to the present day. Recognizing the cultural power of that moment, the autonomy of self-determination and self-production for artists, and the importance of community and the transformation of society have been central forces that have guided Parker's work over the past 50 years as a musician and community organizer. And of course, the aesthetic of that time also provided Parker with some of the tools of his craft and framed some of his artistic outlook. The second quarter of the book examines Parker's beginnings on the music scene, his work in the DIY loft scene of the 1970s, and how his perseverance carried him into the difficult decade of the 1980s that witnessed the country divesting itself of public support of the arts on a mass scale. His political vision became more and more solidified as conditions eroded, and in his own mindset, it became clearer that art had a role in righting the wrongs of a society that was quickly eroding and losing itself. In 1984, he wrote, "We cannot separate the starving child from the starving musician. Both things are caused by the same things: capitalism, racism, and the putting of military spending ahead of human rights. The situation of the artist is a reflection of America's whole attitude toward life and creativity." Later in the same statement, he concluded, "The idea is to cultivate an audience by performing as much as possible on a continuous basis, not waiting to be offered work, rather creating work, uniting with all those who hear. We must put pressure on those with power to give some of it up. And finally, we must define ourselves and not be defined by others. We must take control of our lives, building a solid foundation for the future." Parker drew upon a lineage of ideas that connected with the visionary publication, The Cricket, created by a circle of writers in the 1960s, and more indirectly back to the publication of Fire from the days of the Harlem Renaissance. Parker echoed Larry Neal's statement that appeared in The Cricket in 1968, in which Neal wrote, quote, "The true voices of Black liberation have been the Black musicians. They were the first to free themselves from the concepts and sensibilities of the oppressor. The history of Black music is a history of a people's attempt to define the world in their own terms. They have been the priests of pure wisdom, in essence, the voice of a people." Parker's manifesto, titled "In Order to Survive, a Statement," appears in the book in its entirety, and was to be the name of his first prominent band in the 1990s. Art, politics, and survival have organically coexisted throughout all of William Parker's work. Since the mid-1990s, William Parker has established himself at the forefront of the music. While he has contributed to the growth and redefinition of free jazz, he has also challenged the categories and refused to be hemmed in by such definitions. His pursuit of what he calls universal tonality, the title of the book, has been a lifelong quest. Universal tonality, as he defines it, is the idea that master musicians from any part of the world should be able to meet and, without talking or planning in advance, be able to speak and communicate with one another, not with one voice overwhelming or overshadowing the other, but that each musical voice should be able to communicate to the others equally. The search for universality, while steadfastly maintaining individual identity and concept, has guided much of his work. The last half of the book examines Parker's quest in pursuit of that sound, working with a wide variety of people domestically and around the globe. Commenting on his own experience, Parker stated, "The school of music I wanted to be associated with was the Black Music Revolutionary School. At the same time, I had to be open to the universal school that would reveal itself as time went on." Parker's singular voice has carried him on this musical vision, and he has been prolific in recording each new phase in this understanding of his evolving sound. There are too many bands, gigs, and recordings to concisely summarize here, but work in the 1990s with the quartet In Order to Survive, and his big band, the Little Keeley Creative Music Orchestra, established him as a composer, improviser, and band leader. His encounter with drummer Hamid Drake was transformational, and Drake has featured heavily in many of his projects since 2000. The William Parker Quartet and the expanded version of the group with vocalist Lena Conquest, called Raining on the Moon, embodied this drive toward a universal sound. Then over the past decade, Parker has cast his sights upon ambitious projects as a composer, working deeply with vocalists and instrumentalists in expansive ways. His recent release, the 10 CD box set that Ken mentioned earlier, Migration of Silence into and Out of the Tone World, has been his most ambitious and visionary realization of this lifelong pursuit to date. Everyone should check it out, but also keep your eyes open because there is much more also to come. So I've said enough, I think, for now. I wanted to begin with that as an introduction, and I really want to give ample time and space to William Parker and Professor Reid to contribute to this conversation. I do want to make one last mention before we turn it over to a discussion. One aspect of Parker's work that I think has gone somewhat unappreciated is that he has been a historian himself through his work, in the ways he has made numerous tributes to musicians, both famous and relatively unknown, how he has worked to form and preserve historical memory of particular members of the community, and his own published interviews with his fellow musicians. This has been invaluable work and has formed an archive that would otherwise have been lost, one that will impact how future generations view this music. This has played a direct role in the Free Jazz Oral History Project that I've been working on since 2016, conducting preserving interviews with dozens of artists of the early generations of free jazz. The project now has several other contributors, and we are aiming to build it into a publicly accessible open archive to document these histories. Okay, so I would like to turn it over, turn it back to Ken, and I'd like to move towards a more open discussion between all of us.
Thank you, Cisco, and congratulations again. Anthony, I thought you might want to take this up. You write a lot about collaboration, and that's certainly been something that was a hallmark of the work of William Parker, and kind of contextualizing that kind of cross-art collaboration. I don't know if anybody else heard Theaster Gates and Naomi Beckwith for the Oakley and Weezer show that's opening at the new museum, but that was like how Theaster was like getting this moment, was like the collaboration cross arts. And I was like, that's actually been going on for a long time. So perhaps you could start us off in that direction.
I think I'd actually like, if it's all right, I'd like to start from a slightly different place, and through it to draw us into both the book, which I've been reading and learning so much from, but also the newly released box set, which I'm a slow reader and a slow listener, and so I've been making my way through the music and really trying to listen to it. And one thing that was really striking was hearing, so the third disc begins with a track a composition entitled Baldwin, that features a vocal sample of James Baldwin's voice. To my memory, it's the first sample I can recall hearing on a William Parker record. And so it was striking for that. And as Cisco has already alluded, the discography is so vast, I'm sure I'm just forgetting something. But it was arresting because in the sample, which I think it's from around from the 1960s, James Baldwin is talking about Harlem. And in particular, there's a moment where he talks about the Black church as a space where Black people, many of them recent migrants, could share with one another their experiences, and could do so really engage their own sadness and frustration and anger. And he alludes, Baldwin does, to the idea that the church is no longer that space, that its function had changed within the community, that there were erected new barriers between the church as an institution and the people it served, and for whom it served that place of the expression of those genuine and difficult emotions. And it made me wonder something that I hadn't really thought about, and that I would love to hear William Parker speak to, if you're interested, that if we follow what Baldwin is saying, the alienation of the church as a spiritual and emotional resource for the people in Baldwin's account coincides with the emergence of in the late 60s of free jazz as fully identified with revolution, and also with the kinds of genuine emotion that people ranging from Mary Baraka to Cecil Taylor talked about. And so I wonder if I'm reading correctly, or if I'm overreading, is it the case that the music takes up not only some of the political functions that people like Larry Neal spoke about, but also the spiritual ones? There's a great moment when William Parker is cited in Professor Bradley's book as saying that his spiritual practice allowed him to see about tomorrow. And that sense of tending to is it's both so present in the work and in the many dedications, and the way that the music works to memorialize people like Percy Heath and Malachi Favors, Horace Silver, and so many others. But to think of that as also a kind of, I don't want to say alternative spirituality, but an also available spirituality, a tandem spirituality. And those are just some initial, I wanted to try to put some things together and see if that might be a way to begin our conversation.
Well, the church was always a place where, again, people met and they worshiped and they socialized. And I think over the years, it's sort of, the Black community is still sort of moved by this myth of integrating, of saying, well, okay, we have to become part of the society. That's what we're fighting for, to be able to, to sit at a diner and have a cup of coffee. But in one sense, and the other sense is that realizing that, first of all, that coffee didn't taste that good. Second of all, that the people who were in that diner didn't want you there. It was like, okay, you can sit at the diner, but I still don't want you there, So, and then the idea, okay, well, then let's build our own diner. But we can do that, but we have to have a new blueprint for a diner. We have got to say that we'll never be allowed in the big house. We'll be invited to dinner, but will we be allowed to sit at the banquet table, or will we say, okay, you can come for dinner, but you have to sit in the kitchen? And I think that we got over involved in trying to become like the template for success was what white America had laid out, which is just about making money at all costs, and then forgetting about the culture and the spirituality, and sort of staying anchored in your own, trying to find your own vision, instead of following this vision of making money and being successful in someone else's terms, rather than define one's own terms about what is, what is successful. And it's about James Baldwin. He said, I think he said once about, he didn't want to sit in a cafe next to a redneck named Bubba. And that was not a victory. The victory was to be James and to be recognized for, like, it was hard enough just living in this world. It was hard enough being James Baldwin. And I'd like to just be comfortable being that, and then working from there. And I think one of the things with the civil rights movement is that we all should have been our own catalysts. And we were, when Malcolm X died, Martin Luther King died, certain people, leaders died, then it was, okay, well, now we can try to fit in. We can now move in a direction, but you can't just have leaders. You have to have, everyone's got to be self-motivated and have their own engine to push them forward. Because if you're relying on a great leader, when they go, the air comes out of the balloon and it just fizzles.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up? You're saying that reminds me that you also have a dedication to Fannie Lou Hamer, who spoke so forcefully against the idea of charismatic leadership. But I wanted to maybe from here pivot back into the thinking about your role as, and understandably you would reject the term, but a leader of the jazz community. And I would like to hear, I'm really curious to hear more, because I haven't gotten to read those parts of the book just yet, about how the movement from the Sound and Unity Festival to Vision Fest, and how that to me has always read from the outside as, thank goodness somebody is taking up the kind of Black arts ethos, not in terms of the politics, but in terms of building independent and self-sustaining institutions for the circulation of alternative and radical aesthetics. And I wonder to what extent that's something that you were self-consciously doing with Vision Fest.
Well, musicians have always gone into the role of producing themselves because they were never, at least musicians who played avant-garde or free jazz or black music, they were never included in the mainstream of the music business booking. So in order to play a concert, you had to, rent a loft, get a loft, do some advertising and present your own concert. And people came, and that was just as successful as playing at Carnegie Hall as far as the feeling and inspiration that people would get from the music. And so out of that came, first we tried the Lower East Side Music Festival out of a place called 93 St. Mark's Place, someplace nice. And that was myself and Billy Bang and Roy Campbell, Jalalu Calvert Nelson, trumpet player, who was living in New York at the time. And again, it was the idea, musicians working for musicians, you put up the flyers, you get the space. And then it evolved to being able to connect with the European community. See, the Sound Unity Festival was sponsored by a European artist from East Germany by the name of A.R. Pank, who had a lot of money, and he was really into the music. And he came through his friend Peter Koval, the German bass player, and he said, well, we have an organization, FMP, in Europe, where free music production, where we put on festivals every year. So why don't we try to put a festival here in New York? So I was needed because I was the bridge person, because musicians in New York were very paranoid about people from Europe coming here with money. So I had to be saying that, okay, these people from Europe are cool, and then once they knew them, then they said, okay, they're cool. And we had a meeting around with Bill Dixon, Ahmed Abdullah, and Bill came all the way down from Bennington because Bill had started the Jazz Composers Guild. And we had a meeting and we talked about getting out of the give me a gig mentality, which was it's just not about giving me a gig or, give me a piece of wood. It's about building something and for the future. And so we can be self-reliant. So the idea of that Sound Unity Festivals, we had 100 musicians in the festival and there were no leaders' fees and everybody got paid the same amount of money. And it was for 7 days, and there was a movie made about it called, what's the name? Rising Tones, and where you can get a little glimpse of it. But it was a great start. Then out of that, Patricia Nicholson started the Improvisers Collective, which was again a organization of musicians having weekly gatherings, having orchestras, small kinds of groups, and in a sense, maybe reflective of the AACM, but we were New York, and people supported each other. And out of that came the Vision Festival. And that's been going on for 25 years, again, carrying on the idea of self-determination, of a blending of arts. But all this time, we're since 1972, I remember talking to Billy Bang and Daniel Carter and Roy Campbell, and said, well, how come there are no black people in the audience? Where are the black people? What are they doing? Where are the brothers? And I remember once we did with the Little Huey Orchestra, we played at 125th Street at Marcus Garvey Park. And before the concert, we marched around 125th Street with the big band. And we had dancers and singers. And we marched around twice. Then we went to Marcus Garvey Park and we set up and we're ready to play. I mean, we were like ready to hit it. And we look out in the audience and it's the same audience from downtown that came uptown. So all the people from Harlem who were there who heard it, and it's a free concert, not many of them showed up. So for years, we've been trying to cultivate the Black audience and bring them back, bring the music to them. It's been a difficult proposition, but when they do hear the music, they dig the music. You never have to water it down, and they dig it. But it's just a matter of now the Black community is involved in a lot of stuff, and the outreach of the music to as far as the new musicians coming up being Black and Afro-American, and that cultivating that scene is diminishing. So that's another challenge, is to educate Black audience about their own culture, which they don't know about. Yeah. So it's very important and that's what we're working. That's another thing Arts for Art is doing now, is to education program, try to reach out and bring the music to the young audiences, because all the progenitors of the avant-garde free jazz movement are dying. I mean, who you have, Milford Graves just passed away. So who you have left, you have Andrew Cyril, you have Archie Shepp, you have Dave Burrell, and a few others, Alan Silver, but a lot of the first generation guys are gone. So we have to not, pass on the idea of their music, of our music, because there's so many generations now. We've got to hit the streets, we've got to hit the churches, we've got to begin to really make an outreach to people of color to listen to the music and support their culture.
I was going to ask about that in terms of all of your work, because it occurs to me like one of the first avant-garde things that I was involved in publishing at the press was Horace Tapscott's autobiography, As Told To Autobiography. And that's really a story about being in the community. And, thinking about that, we've just republished John Swed's Sun Ra biography, even working on Randy Weston's book and the kind of community places he made both in Africa and here, trying to think about how does that relation to community happen. And you've done so much to try and produce that. And what do you think makes that be something not just like people coming to the arts, but the arts being kind of inseparable from the community as a whole?
Well, one of the things is about all those people you mentioned, Sun Ra, Horace Tapscott, Randy Weston, is that they didn't leave their communities. And you have to have we say, it's about empowering individuals, but they need inspiration from leaders and people who are going to hold the flock together and educate the flock and empower them to empower themselves. So it's very important to not go to Europe so much, because every musician, the way that it sort of pans out, whether you're the most famous musician or the least famous, you want to go to Europe because America is culturally underdeveloped. And so you go to Europe, you're treated like a king. You get to play for thousands and thousands of people. You're paid well. You get to tour. You get to meet people who love your music. And so we always said that America has to be developed. We have to stop going to Europe and spend some time developing America, because if we don't, it's just gonna go by the wayside. What we have, 72 million people, voted for Trump this year. So there's something where we need to develop America's culture, and we need to, yes, go to Europe on a treat. Yes, go to Europe and play and share our culture to Europe, China, South America, but that we've never really had any real culture, because America is a melting pot that's never melted. And you ride the New York subway, you see all all kinds of people on the subway, from Poland, I played in Poland, from Serbia, I played in Serbia, from Lithuania, I played there, from Japan, from Brazil, from Argentina, all these places I played at. And then when everyone gets off at their stop and they go to their place, and you never see them again till you ride the subway next day. So, I mean, the thing is that every person going to a school should have a exchange where you spend 6 months or 3 months with a family in Vietnam, where a Vietnamese kid comes here and spends 6 months, 3 months with you, where you go to China, where you go to Japan, where you go to different countries, and you realize that these people are human, they realize you're human, and then next time they say, okay, we want to drop some bombs on Iraq, you say, no, I'm not dropping a bomb on Iraq. Those are my brothers over there and my sisters, because I spent with them, I know them, but we don't know anything. We don't know anything about the world. It's not taught. It's just that what we're taught is that we're great and everyone else isn't. And that's kind of a sad story. Now how can nobody else in the world be great except us? And if you read our history, it says, well, it doesn't sound so great to me. So I think that we need to really develop America culturally through the schools. I mean, every school could be you have an auditorium in the school, that's a concert hall. Every Friday could be a concert. You have walls in the library, that can be an art gallery. And every school in America should have an artist in residence for the whole year. Or there should be an artist, a visual artist, a dancer, and a musical artist, and where they do workshops in the school where people are trained to learn about culture. The highway system, wherever you have a rest stop, you have your McDonald's have a bandstand on the weekends. And you have a bandstand at 12 o'clock, a string quartet is playing at exit 3. At 2 o'clock, the jazz band is playing at exit 44. Poets are playing at this exit. Dancers are dancing at that exit. So then people begin to really get into what culture is like. The tonality is just not pop music, and everything isn't built off of whatever the pop music is. So it has to be spread around and developed, but it just wasn't. And that's one of the things that, the question is, how do you do it? A lot of musicians are hitting 70. And like I say, he said, I've done everything I could do. And, I'm going down. So then again, I'll inspire the younger musicians to try to do something so that the next generation maybe is a little better off. Because these things are very simple. Putting an artist in a public school, what we call the Music Man program. The Music Man program is where you just have a musician sit in the hallway and play their saxophone. Don't say a word. And every day these kids see the Music Man playing the saxophone, and back and forth. And then after a while, the next week it's a trumpet, and the next week, and then they begin to answer the questions about what is that? And then you start communicating with them. And so by osmosis, they begin to learn about music. They begin to learn about dance. They begin to learn about that they're valuable. See, a lot of kids, by the time they're 11 years old, don't care if they live or die. That's pretty, 11, 12 years old, you don't care whether you live or die. That's a bad sign. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think the arts can be very instrumental in helping this out and moving this forward, because it has to be done. We do have to have a change here, and it's got like a lot of drops in a big bucket.
Thank you so much, William, for that, all of that. I was wondering if I could pose a question. I'd love to pose this to William, and Anthony, if you'd like to offer your thoughts as well. William, one of the things that came out almost from the very beginning of our conversations that came to form this book is you talking about yourself as a self-taught musician, sort of autodidact, teaching yourself, learning kind of from within your own system, and that whole process. I'm wondering if you could talk kind of about how you formulated that process. I mean, I know some of this is in the book, but I'd love to hear you talk about it more in terms of being your own teacher and guide, and kind of the way in which you came to this process and your music ultimately.
Well, and I was thinking, I got up around 4 o'clock this morning. I was actually thinking about this, because I've been thinking about the blues and the very old blues singers who did not go to Juilliard, and who were, for most part, things were passed down from elders, and the stories, the methods, how do you make a banjo, how do you build an instrument? Because you learn that in African systems, you build your own instrument. You study with a teacher, you live with the teacher, then they teach you how to make your instrument, and then you learn how to play it. So the idea of choice of how you wish to approach an instrument is very, very open. If you find that when I started playing, I played the trumpet very early, then the trombone, then I went to the cello, and then I went, studying the bass. And then I began to see that every musician had their own there were common pedagogies. Okay, everyone learns scales and everyone learns notes. But then you discover that there's something called sound. Okay, and then you start saying, what's the difference between a sound and a note? Okay, a sound is when you don't know what notes are. A sound is in between notes. It's not based off the piano. Okay, that's not scientifically codified. It's a sound. It's like a mother saying, uh-oh, I hear my baby crying. Now, how does she know that that's her baby? But she hears the baby crying and she runs right upstairs and the baby's crying. And so you get to learn that things have value that aren't necessarily taught in the classroom, because you're not trying to codify yourself. You're trying to individualize yourself and be yourself. So, I think one of the greatest lessons I learned was studying with Wilbur Ware, and Wilbur would play something on the bass, and then he'd hand me the bass, and if I played it like him, he'd say, no, you're wrong. Then he'd play something else, and then he handed it to me, and he said, no, you're wrong. Then if I played it my way, he said, that's it. And he said, you don't ever sound like your teacher. Don't sound like me. I'm supposed to sound like me. You got to sound like you. And everybody's got a different you, whether you know something or not. Because I never did figure out whether Wilbur knew anything about music. I said, Wilbur, what do you know? Do you know anything about music? And he'd say to me, what's music? And then he'd laugh, But wherever I took, wherever we were traveling together, we'd go to a club, and the other bass players, when Wilbur walked in, they were like very respectful of Wilbur. And he was, so he really taught me that don't be afraid to be an individual. Don't be afraid to develop your own pedagogy. Don't be afraid to learn things your way. And it's the most important thing is whether you're in the end, whether your music or whatever you do, your writing moves people. I mean, Amiri Baraka spoke a lot about that, where he would invent and expand terms, Like you have a haiku, he would always talk about, I have the low-ku. And he would use sound in his words and play off his words musically. And so where you could, it's like listening to, Ernesto Cardenal, the Spanish poet, and not really understand Spanish, but at the end, you're grooving with him. Because is that a word is a sound, but a word also has a meaning. So a sound is a sound, it's a note, but it's also a sound that's independent of that particular reference to the piano. but it could be a reference to people digging in the mud. It could be workers working. It could be a reference to people picking rice or fishing. So there's all kinds of ways of learning music. And then when you define music as something, and this you get from Hazrat Enid Khan, the Sufi master, you begin to define music as anything that's beautiful. You see, we think music is sound, putting sounds together, but when you have that broader definition of music is anything that's beautiful, then it makes really perfect sense of going past just music is, harmony and rhythm, but music is anything that is beautiful.
I also just want to thank you for what you just said and for the vision that you outlined previously of what would a culture that was within which arts were truly respected and integrated look like. The idea of, pulling off in that rest area, and there might be a string quartet or a dance performance or a poet, is so unlike what we actually live in. And it's really something to aspire to. I think that it's also hearing what you said about sound. I've heard so many musicians I've been fortunate enough to meet and who've been willing to talk to me, people who are at a certain level. It no longer is about this is what you do in this chord progression, or this is what you do here, or how you resolve that. It really does become about sound. And I guess I wonder if we can talk about the 80s and what happened with jazz education. And in particular, the real discrepancy between the vision of music making, of making music together, of commitment to other people at a profound at the profound level that you're describing. And it looks like maybe this can lead into other questions as well. But that I've always wondered if part of the ways that, or part of the reason that professionals, the people who book clubs, who write textbooks and so on, have a hard time positioning free jazz, because it's a lot of musicians creating standards of excellence that are much more difficult to codify. That the number of people who tie themselves in knots trying to link Cecil Taylor to the Second Viennese School, for example, which I think is just an impoverished way to listen. But it works if what you want to do is have the music accessible to the scholar of Schoenberg. If you want it for tenure and promotion. So I don't want to ramble. And I know that I only know of one place in a song title with Other Directions in Music, you refer to Wynton Marsalis as a kind of figure around whom the standards of musical excellence that now inform jazz education really coalesce. And so I wonder if it's worth sparing a word about that, and if you would want to.
Well, you see, part of originally improvised music or jazz was supposed to be not about a style. It was supposed to be about collective improvisation and individuality. But now, if you have 20 musicians and they're all individuals, you say, well, we have to have something common going here to bring everybody together. But the thing is that people are together by being individuals, and that's what brings them together. That's what brings them. And they know when to play fast, when to play slow, when to add what they have to add. And all the older musicians were playing free. Coleman Hawkins, if you ask Coleman Hawkins, you feel restricted in what you're playing, Coleman? He said, no, I don't feel restricted. Sonny Rollins, he doesn't feel restricted. Ben Webster, because it's like, it's endless. It's the ancient is the future. And and something beautiful doesn't age, it doesn't dwindle, it's always beautiful. And it doesn't have to be experimental. Was Charlie Parker experimental? No, when Bird played it, it was beautiful. It was beautiful, and it was you liked it, and people who and it was closer to what you call free music than what we think it was. So if you listen to the way you hear the talks about, like Monk was saying, from time to time, he asked in one of those films about Monk, he said, well, Charlie Rouse was asking him, well, what should I play? And Monk said, play anything you want to play, which is one of the doctrines for creative or free music, is that you play what you want to play to bring the beautiful beast flower to life. And to try to codify it limits it. It's like saying, well, you, as a guy who grew up in Tennessee or Texas, and you're Black, or whatever, you are limited to this vision. You can't move here to your left, you can't move to your right. You're limited to seeing these things because we've got to be able to teach what you do to others. And in order to teach it, we've got to put it in a box. Not realizing that you can teach it without putting it in a box if you accept the reality of everyone's vision. And that's one of the problems, is that you say, okay, well, jazz is democracy, I've been hearing lately. Yes, no. I mean, I think that most jazz musicians don't want to call their music jazz in the first place. Okay. So what do they want to call it? They call it whatever they want to call it. But jazz is about individuality. It's about compassion. It's about love. It's about revolution. It's about not just having, everyone plays and they interchange and you play 8 bars that's not going to change the world. That's going to keep the world going just the way it is. If you want to change the world, you got to break out of that. You got to make some mistakes. You got to go past the bar lines.
So this hour is going by all too quickly. We had a question from a member of Little Huey, Chris Jonas, who's on. So maybe they could ask their own question here. Chris, can you get on?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks for including me. William, it's a delight to hear you talk again and to see you after all these years.
Hey, man.
I was in Little Huey throughout the 90s. And one of the things that I think about a lot is, you remember we played the Lyon Festival, and it was Little Huey Orchestra, and we stayed in a small hotel, and it was just enough room for our band and also the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra. And, and I think we shared the night. And the difference between the two bands not only was kind of musical, but it felt differently. And I remember us all being in the breakfast, in the dining room and eating breakfast, and just getting a sense of how, even though we're all playing this thing jazz, really it was there was a different vibe to both bands. And I think a lot of it had to do, William, with the fact that we're this mishmash of cultures and people and musical styles and capabilities. Some people were great readers and some people didn't care about reading music, and and you never told us like, oh, you're totally screwing up the music, you've got to play it this way. Whoever showed up however they showed up. And in a lot of ways, I think that the music itself was the function of us being a band was not to take your compositions and do perfect versions of them, as was the case with the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra. But instead, it was kind of an example of a community of people working together across our differences. And the quote I put into the chat, there's a great man here named Roberto Bedoya, who's always struggling with this question of culture. You know, everybody here in New Mexico is always looking for how can we use culture for better economic benefits and whatever. And Roberto would say, culture is not a thing, it's a verb. And I think that in a lot of ways, like little Huey exemplified that idea. You know, you cultivated a community of people within the band. And when we got on stage, the music was half of it, but also just the example of a group of people working together right there on stage. You know, the music was, it pulled us together. It was a living, breathing thing. It was a verb. Music was a verb. It wasn't a product that we were bringing out to the world. So, and I remember as a young musician, that absolutely blew my mind. And, you know, it's led to a lifetime of really looking at art as having a function about human beings and not just about a musical product. And William, where does that come from you? I mean, where did you get that? Where did you learn that?
Oh, Jesus.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I just found that it worked. I mean, in dealing with music coming up, you say, okay, well, I played with Daniel Carter in duo. Then we add Billy Bang, and then we add a drummer, and we don't say anything. We just play, and there's this magic that happens. And so it's like one thing is like say, okay, well, how come you can't do that with a big band and just let it happen? And there's no reason why you can't. There's no reason why you can't do it with a big band. And so that's how it was cultivated by experience, and then seeing what worked. And what didn't work was when it was when it was tight and choking, it wasn't breathing for me. And I just found that I couldn't duplicate the fact when it was loose and breathing. There was nothing there was no formula for it except to allow it to be itself. That was sort of the formula.
Thank you. Maybe we're really, it's a little after 1, but maybe everybody could go around and say some last thing. Anthony, if you want to start, maybe we'll end up with Cisco since we're celebrating his book. And thanks very, very much.
I really just want to say thank you. William Parker, your music has just meant so much to me at different points. And the energy, the feeling in it has really been, I just continually return to it, both the work with others and in your own ensembles. And I'm really grateful for the chance that this book is in the world and that we got to have this conversation. Thank you for everything that you do.
Well, I hope looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
And thank you.
I wanted to thank everybody here. First of all, thank you, Ken, for moderating today. It's been really invigorating discussion here. Thank you, Professor Reid. I feel you expanded our conversation in so many ways and brought in so many valuable perspectives, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to engage with your work. And yeah, I'd love to carry on the conversation for sure. So it's been a real pleasure, and I am, as William said, I'm also really looking forward to reading your book. So I can't wait to get into it. And I wanted to say thank you to William because when we embarked on this process of writing working on this book, I had no idea how things would be. And I think I just was saying this to William yesterday in a phone conversation. I mean, writing a biography about a person who's a living person who's actively engaged as an artist, who's as accomplished as William is, your best work may still be to come. So how to write a book about someone who's so involved and active and doing all these things, I didn't know how that would be, and it's been a true honor to work with you through this. It's one of these things. I remember, I'd write we did a lot of interviews, and I'd go back and I'd write sections and bring it, and I show it to William at certain times, and working, to some degree in a collaborative process was just absolutely amazing, and definitely exceeded any kind of expectations that I had as a writer, thinking about how this would go. So it's just been an absolute pleasure from beginning to end. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of your future work too. So thank you, William.
Thank you.
I just want to thank everyone for coming and being such a attentive audience. I feel like we got a real set of gifts today, and I'm going to be taking them through the week, and I hope they bring you through the week in a different fashion as well. People who haven't heard the WNGO, the Newark Public Radio Station hour, definitely should check that out. It's a really great moment, and I really, it's nice to be able to celebrate while people are here and still giving. So thank you all, and have a good weekend, good rest of the day.
Okay, thank you.